Today, what if everyone is wrong?
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
Now, let me clarify what I mean by saying everyone is wrong. Saying everyone is wrong does not mean that everything everyone says is wrong. That should make you feel a little more comfortable with the conversation that we need to have today, because this is something that's inherently true about us as human beings. We are not flawless. We are not perfect. And yet we very often position ourselves as if one side is completely right and the other side is completely wrong. And by doing this, we put ourselves into an erroneous position. So, when I pastored for a long time before I became president at Criswell College, before I even became a professor. I pastored for a long time. I did ministry work for a long time. And in that work, I did a lot of counseling in terms of pastoral counseling, just sitting down with people and as a person who knew about the things they cared about and shared values with them, could sort of share from experience and a position of confidence and give them some guidance on where to go. So just sort of pastoral counseling. And by the way, all of that experience that I got as a pastor over 20 years or so is largely what informs some of the devotionals that I do at the website, barrycreamer.com. So if you haven't had a chance to go there, see the devotionals, I would encourage you to go look at them if you're interested in that kind of thing, just on a weekly basis, maybe picking one out and getting an encouragement to maintain a spiritual attitude about life and the direction that we're going. And for me, I'm always painting it from as a picture, as a person who's following Jesus. So that's what I do. But I want to communicate with every person about these issues. So if you get a chance to look at that, please do. But in my pastoral counseling, when I would have couples come in and describe a problem, or a family come in and describe a situation, it was often the case that everybody would come in assuming somebody was going to leave mad, right? So my teenager is terrible, so I need to bring them to you, and you need to tell them what's for. And they would assume that the teenager was going to leave angry. The teenager would come in saying, my parents don't understand me at all. And they would assume that I needed to correct their parent, and not necessarily assume that I was willing to do it, but they would assume that needed to happen. And so they would say, well, they would go on the assumption their parent was going to leave angry. In reality, I would say to them, look, by the time this is done, you're all going to be angry, okay? Because nobody's right in this situation, which was almost inconceivable. And I do say that in the Princess Bride sense. It was almost inconceivable to them that everybody could be wrong, because they were certain the other person was wrong. And if the other person was wrong, that made them right. But that's a mistake in our reasoning, in our way of thinking. So let me take the issues in particular. And by issues, this time, I mean in the example that I was giving a moment ago. So a teenager comes in and they're being disrespectful and irresponsible in their lives, their parents say, and their parents come in with the teenager. And the teenager is saying, well, they're overbearing and they're unrealistic in their expectations, and those things make sense. Those accusations make sense. On those issues, this is the point. It could be the case that all of those things are true. It could be the case that a teenager is disrespectful and irresponsible, and that at the same time, parents are being overbearing and unrealistic. It could be the case that either could be adjusted a little bit and make things right, but both could be wrong. And if you add even more complex issues, or a more complex way of understanding the relationship between the issues that are going on in a family like this, and I'm just bringing it up with a family as an example. I'll give examples of what's going on in contemporary culture in just a moment. But, maybe the teenager is completely wrong on their behavior, and the parent is completely correct about what they're saying regarding the teenager. But maybe and I mean even about responsibility on the teenager side, but also expectations on the parent side. Maybe the parents are completely right for what they're asking the teenager to do, and the teenager is completely wrong on what they're actually doing. But then maybe the parent is completely wrong about how relationships with maturing children actually work. Maybe the challenge is that one person is just dealing with trying to move on in life and become an adult, and the other is dealing with trying to keep their kid a kid. That's a completely different set of problems. And in one set of problems, the teenager's wrong, and in the other set of problems, the parent is wrong. My point is simply this. It is not only possible, but extremely likely that in every single situation where there's a conflict, everybody's wrong. I know that sounds like I'm saying, oh, well, then there's nothing right at all. We're all just muddling around and figuring out. I'm not saying that at all. I believe in right and wrong, truth, beauty, justice. I believe in those things, and I believe they are fixed. The problem is not truth, beauty, and justice. The problem is us. We don't live out truth perfectly. We don't live our lives with perfect beauty, and so on. You get the idea. The logic behind this problem in our thinking is the difference between contradictories and contraries. If you'll hang with me for just a few minutes to talk about this, I know it sounds philosophical. It is. It's logic. I teach logic at Criswell College where I'm president. I love teaching logic. I love people starting to see more clearly, think more analytically about things. Doesn't mean I can think perfectly, but this one's pretty basic, and it's pretty ancient in its origin. So I'm pretty sure it's going to be right. I mean, it comes from Aristotle, this thing called the square of opposition. Not going to do the whole square. I'm just going to be here for a second. Please just hang with me through this one part, because we need to rethink how we assess other people's positions and the way we've assessed those positions on the basis of our own. And it's very difficult for us to do it because we get confused. We make a mistake. We think this is the problem behind our thinking. The difference between contradictories, when things contradict one another, and contraries. They're both kinds of opposition. This is why Aristotle has a square of opposition, because it describes all of these different ways that things are opposites. I mean, you might think girl is the opposite of rock, but it's not. Girl is the opposite of boy. But they're opposites because they're almost exactly the same thing. It's just they're different in gender, and that's it. Everything else is the same. Young human being, that whatever. The point is that there are all kinds of different opposites, and we confuse them and therefore make some mistakes in our judgments about other people. And two of those kinds of opposites are called contradictories and contraries. And we have to learn the distinction between those. And it's a very simple distinction if you can think through it with me for just a few minutes. Hang with me for a second. So on contradictories, when you say one thing over here and then you contradict it, literally using the word the way I'm talking about right now, you contradict it, then what you're saying is, if this is false, if on one side this thing is false, then that must be true. They're contradictory. And because they're contradictory, if this is true, then that must be false. Only one can be true, only one can be false. You say, what on earth is this guy talking about? Okay, well, let me give you an example of a couple of political parties. And we won't talk about actual political parties because rhetoric is so heated, we can't think clearly once we introduce an actual political party. So we'll just make up political parties and use those instead. So let's just say there's a spine party and a heart party. You can decide whatever you want those parties to represent. It's not hard to figure out what they could represent, but the spine party and the heart party. I think spines are good. I think hearts are good. So I don't mean anything pejorative in those labels. So we've got those two parties. And let's say they have opposite social positions. The spine party says welfare is terrible. Regulation destroys business and therefore it destroys the economy. And the heart party says, well, the poor can't be expected to even have a hardworking job, and job protections are the only way to save the workforce and therefore the economy. Those two positions are opposite of each other, and that's okay. They have opposite social positions. But it is not the case that in those positions, if one of them is wrong, the other is right. That is not the case. That is, one thing being false doesn't make the other thing true. And this is what we do all the time. We say, you're wrong, therefore I must be right. Or I'm right, and therefore you must be wrong. Now, in the latter case, sometimes it holds, even with contraries. Hold on, we'll get there in a minute. But right now, just stick with this. It's not the case that if somebody's wrong, that makes you right. So, for instance, welfare may foment a problem that hard work also fails to solve. It's possible that both parties, the heart party and the spine party, it's possible that they're both wrong. Regulation. Remember we were giving these sample parties? One of them prefers regulation. One of them says no, deregulation. Regulation. It's possible that regulation may stifle businesses and that those businesses will abuse their employees if they're not regulated. It's possible that they're both wrong in some sense. One of them being wrong doesn't inherently make the other right, and not only just on the issues in the very narrowly defined scope, but broadening it out like we were talking about with the family, where one person's just trying to think about how to move on with life, and the other person's thinking about how an individual human being behaves the best way, and they're different issues at different times. In that same way, this could affect more than one domain of discussion. And so saying that the other guy is wrong doesn't make me right. Contraries invite this recognition. And with politics, it happens all of the time because both parties could be wrong about something. I'm not talking actual parties. We're just talking figments of my imagination, spine party and heart party. If both parties can say things that oppose each other and they can still both be wrong. Contraries like that, where both parties could be wrong, invite the recognition that not. Now, and this is additional. This goes beyond simply talking about opposites. It invites the recognition that not every problem has a solution which doesn't involve its own problems. That is, sometimes things are contrary and both parties may be wrong, and yet they both may be presenting pretty much all we can think of to try to address a problem. And if you say, what are you saying? There are things to which there's no solution. How could you even suggest such a thing? Because we live in a fallen world, and sins have reverberations. Things that people do that are wrong can carry on from one generation to the next, or from one moment to the next, or from one party to the next, or from one administration to the next. Because that can happen, it's just not the case that there's always a clean and easy solution to everything that's gone wrong in the past. There is no easy solution to some of the violations that happen to people in life. You can't simply say to a person, hey, I know this terrible thing happened to you. I know you were mugged, you were abused, something awful happened to you in your life, but that was last week and now everything's all right. So let's just move on and everything's okay. There are some times that we have to admit there are going to be residuals to things. There are going to be problems, a residue. There's going to be a problem left over that is not easily soluble. And sometimes we're going to have to look at current situations which require us to do something and acknowledge that no matter what we do, it's going to have its own problems built into it. There's a reason I'm not saying this so that we would be pessimistic. We still live in a world where we're expected to do, where we're expected to plant and to water and then to harvest and to look for fruit and to be productive, and all of those things make us better people. All that's important. I'm not saying this to be discouraging. I'm not a cynic about these things. But it is important for us to deal realistically with what's going on so that we can regard other people less inherently as our adversaries and more inherently as our cohabitants in a world that's fallen. And, so let me give you some specific examples. I mean, let's talk about some of the issues in the world that are going on right now where we question what people do on the other side or what people would have done on the other side. And I think often overlook this distinction where there may always be a problem associated with some of those things. In just a moment. So, if we're going to look at current issues that seem to have no good solution, Afghanistan just jumps up and begs for attention. The withdrawal from Afghanistan for U.S. troops. And by the way, I remember just enough. I was just old enough to be, old enough, engaged enough in the news and all the things that were going on to be paying attention to all of this when it was happening with the Soviet Union before. I remember it being characterized as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, for them to be in the quagmire of Afghanistan, which could never be won, a war that they could never win. And so now I'm watching what's happening with the United States having withdrawn from Afghanistan and trying to resolve how to move forward with the Taliban in position and all the things that are going on, and really the catastrophic disappointment and failure in executing a clean withdrawal, certainly not that, or even, I think a lot of people would say, even a successful withdrawal in some ways. So this has been really rough, and for people to evaluate it, just understand what's going on, sometimes they're just using it as to score political points. They're just attacking the person on the other side. But there are so many ideas here. And I'm not defending or advocating for Joe Biden or Donald Trump and what they did regarding Afghanistan, or Barack Obama or George W. Bush and what they did regarding Afghanistan. Not concerned about the personalities, just looking at what happened. And this has been a 4-administration long success in some ways and utter failure in other ways. And that's the point of this conversation, to say you don't have to pick which way you're going to say it. Did we accomplish some things? Of course we did. That's why we were there. Did we fail to accomplish some things? Well, of course we did. And how could we be surprised by that? It is not a utopian world. And this is not a world in which we can create a utopia. So if you look at the withdrawal itself, you have a way of looking at it where ideas aren't even related to each other that you can express that some people think seem to contradict each other. They're not even in opposition to each other. For instance, about the withdrawal. Hey, it's a great idea that we withdraw. Okay, fine. Let's say it's a great idea that we withdrew. I mean, I realize we've already done it, but I'm saying, let's say in the debate about it, it's a great idea that we withdraw. And then let's say that the statement, but the withdrawal was executed so terribly. Well, does that mean we shouldn't have withdrawn? They're independent ideas. The fact that you're going to do something doesn't mean you're going to do it well, doesn't mean you have the people in place to do it well, doesn't mean it was well thought out or executed. Nor, if you had done it well, does it mean that it was the right thing to do. Those are independent ideas. So there's no opposition there at all. And you don't have to oppose the other person simply because, for instance, the withdrawal was done poorly on whether the withdrawal should have been done. And some people have recognized that, and I appreciate that. That's easy. But there are also contradictories that come up, these areas where you would say, oh, no, these are opposites, and if one of them is true, the other's false, and vice versa. So here, let's say it. We should withdraw. Why? Let's just hold that position for a moment. We should withdraw, or it was a good thing that we withdrew. Well, number one, can't have troops there forever. That's an easy statement to make, and almost everybody agrees with that. We shouldn't have troops in a place like that forever. Not everybody agrees, but a lot of people do agree with that. And secondly, we shouldn't do nation building. I remember George W. Bush even making that comment a long time ago before we got involved in this whole process. So we shouldn't do nation building. We shouldn't have our troops there forever. Makes it easy to argue we should withdraw. On the other hand, if you hold the other position, no, we shouldn't withdraw, we can't do it. Why would that be? Well, one reason, and this has kept us there for 20 years, one reason is withdrawals vacuum. Because anytime power leaves, something rushes in to fill the vacuum of power that was there. I mean, automatically, it's going to happen. Even without planning or strategy, it's going to happen. So withdrawals vacuum will invite future conflict and more troops having to return anyway. That's one of the arguments against withdrawing. If you withdraw, they're just going to rush in, there's going to be opposition, and then we're going to end up having to send troops back, and then it's more dangerous and more hazardous, so we ought to just keep the troops there. I'm not making that case. I'm saying people have made that case for a long time. Secondly, on the side of not withdrawing, people have said we need a different regime in place, which would present. So if we need a different regime in places, these places need our regime in place. I'm using the word place in too many different ways, aren't I? So you get the idea, though. We need to have a regime in power in places which would present a constant threat to the U.S. if we didn't have a better regime in place, right? So that's the argument for it. So we basically put a regime in place and help hold them in place while they establish themselves, we thought, or we were thinking, so that the U.S. could be safer in the long term. But we couldn't find a point at which we could say safely, well, we can leave and now that regime can manage it. And so we ended up staying and staying and staying until eventually someone said, well, these two ideas can't exist. They can't coexist forever. Either we have to say, okay, it is the case that we're going to leave our troops here forever, or we're going to have to acknowledge that we're going to end up with a vacuum of power and someone else is going to rush in and there's going to be a hazard. Those are contradictory positions, and either position, you'll notice, they're contradictory on the issue. Either position leads to a negative consequence. It leads to a problem. If you embrace one, this is what I don't get about us as people. I don't get why we can't embrace one or the other and say, and you're right, it's going to leave that problem. It's going to create that issue. And so now let's start talking about that issue. Instead of saying, no, I'm right. We don't have to stay there forever, and there won't be a problem. There just won't be a problem. We're going to leave, and then everything's going to be fine. We have to deal with the reality that contradictories are sometimes real and create this issue where we can't have it both ways. Have your cake and eat it too. Contradictories, by the way. Contrary, if we took this in a slightly different position, like I was talking about contraries a moment ago on Afghanistan, we could have a sample position, for instance, where we say, oh, well, okay, if we leave, then the injustice is going to increase, likely. Women are going to face oppression. Christians are going to face unbelievable oppression, already are. So injustice is going to multiply, and terrorist threats are going to multiply. If we leave, that's going to happen. If we stay, here's a contrary position. If we stay, we will basically be rehearsing the colonialism the 20th century's history ultimately condemned. I mean, what are we doing if it's not colonialism? If we are saying you cannot maintain a regime that holds these values that are important to us as a nation, but we're going to stay and enforce those values with our military. I'm not even accepting this position. I'm just defining it for you so you can hear it. Those are contrary positions. If we reject staying because it's too colonial, too colonializing, and we accept the position, if we leave, then injustice and terrorist threats are going to multiply, we're holding contrary positions. They can't both be true. But they could both be wrong in some way. And are they? I don't know. I'm not trying to evaluate the positions, but I am saying this. We are left with the reality that if those positions are legitimate, and they do both seem to have some legitimacy to them, if both of those positions are legitimate, then we're left with the reality that there is no decision that a person could make that would be free of legitimate criticism, not just criticism. I'm not saying just pot shots from the side, but of legitimate criticism. And that's why if you look back, by the way, over the last 4 presidencies regarding Afghanistan, Presidents Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden all knew that these things were true. They all knew these were issues. I mentioned to you George W. Bush bringing it up at the beginning, that nation building was not a good idea. And yet here we are trying to build nations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And so from the beginning, all 4 presidents have known that, and yet they all moved forward with strategies which were critiqued by their opposition on areas that deserved critique, that deserved criticism. But there was no option that wasn't going to bring criticism. I've never been a fan of Donald Trump. If you don't know that, you can know it now. For those of you who are still listening now, I've never been a fan of his. But when he sat down and signed the thing last February with the Taliban and other people were just attacking it as the craziest thing that ever happened in the history of the world, that was not something I criticized, because I recognized that there was no good answer in Afghanistan. And I don't mean by that it's hopeless and there's nothing to do. But I mean, there's no answer that doesn't involve problems. And moving beyond that, just thinking of what this kind of analysis, this kind of evaluation of things would do if we were looking at presidents, for instance. So I'll go back two steps so we don't have to be so, infuriated by the conversation about the most recent presidents. I'll just go to Bush and Obama, because then when we thought the nation was being torn apart by two people, we were wrong. It wasn't until the next two presidents that we would really experience the rift. But looking at George W. Bush, if I talk about the Patriot Act, look, did it bring more security? Absolutely. And I remember his interview where he's talking about the priority that he had on his administration after 9/11. And I appreciated what he said. I get what he said, which was, I wanted to make sure one thing was true, that I would finish my administration and we would not have another terrorist attack. I wanted to make sure the nation would be safe. And if you're president and your presidency begins with what happened on September 11th, then you can understand exactly why he would say that. I get that. But the Patriot Act had serious problems in terms of violating the privacy of American citizens. It was a serious threat to our rights to privacy. And this is not, those statements don't make me say there was no reason to adopt the Patriot Act. Nor does it make me say, oh, we have to protect the Patriot Act at all costs because the only thing that matters is our security. It doesn't do that to me. It makes me say we constantly have to balance priorities. And balance means that to gain on one side is suffering a legitimate loss on the other side. Acknowledging that you could have a legitimate loss on the other side doesn't mean you can't stay on your side. The fact that there's a cost on the other side doesn't mean you can't make your decision. The fact that you're going to give up money in order to buy something doesn't mean you're not going to give up the money, but you have lost the money. This is a complication many people don't realize when, as a couple, one person buys something and the other one says, well, if you're going to spend money, I get to spend money. That's the opposite of what should be true, and yet we do it all the time. I'm not even telling you not to do it. I'm not giving you a lecture about your family, but I am saying, when you spend the money, that doesn't mean you have more money. It means you have less because you said, I'm going to give that money up in order to possess this thing that I think is worth more to me than the money was. But that doesn't mean the money was worthless. That's the same thing here. Privacy is not worthless just because giving up some of it gives us more security. Security is not worthless just because giving up some of it means I can have more privacy. Balancing priorities is what we do in life. But we act as if when somebody prioritizes their values slightly differently from us, suddenly they are egregiously wrong. They're barely even human beings. I'm mystified by how we can take this approach and not recognize that what we're really talking about are very slight differences. And I don't mean the values aren't important, but very slight differences between people who are trying to prioritize values that ought to matter to all of us. Security should matter to all of us. Privacy should matter to all of us. And indeed it does. So it's funny to me that we can't, and I don't want to use the word nuance again to go back to the Peacemakers episode that we did right at the beginning, but I am. I mean, I just did. I let it slip out. It's not just nuance, it's clarity. It's being able to say, yes, I recognize that we will have to give up some privacy in order to do this. And yet I believe it's best because the security is a priority. And then you make a decision on the full information about it. And I could do the same thing with Obama. If we move forward to Barack Obama, from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, then I would say, of course I disagree. I'm an advocate of the pro-life position. I'll come back to that issue in just a few minutes. I'm an advocate of the sanctity of human life. I believe it's hugely important that it be protected. Barack Obama is an adamant advocate for abortion rights, and I don't agree with him on that at all. I'm adamantly, completely on the opposite side of the abortion issue from Barack Obama. But the man had a really nice family, and he took unbelievably good care of them. And I mean, while he was president, he modeled being a good husband and father. Now, I don't, that doesn't mean I approve of every single thing he did or every decision he made as a politician. I just told you, I disagree with every recommendation he made for the Supreme Court or for a lot of judges in other capacities because of his commitment to being promote abortion, or at least to tolerate or allow abortions. I'm a pro-life person, so I'm not going to agree with him on that. But that doesn't make him a bad father to his daughters. That doesn't make him a bad husband. And it's really funny that we can't acknowledge both sides of that coin. We can't acknowledge that a person with whom we disagree on one thing could be a person we could actually acknowledge as human and worthy of respect on another issue. And in fact, on all issues worthy of respect, even if we disagree with them. So let me just pick that up. On that exact issue, the sanctity of human life, this becomes the question. So when I talk about the sanctity of human life, and I choose that language because I am pro-life, I recognize that not everybody would take that language. And I'm not going to be jumping on some crazy bandwagon here. I just want to make the point. I'm being honest about it here. I'm completely and wholeheartedly committed to the sanctity of human life. I'm brokenhearted. I fall apart when I think about people who are making decisions, not because they're selfish, because they're evil, because they're whatever we want to characterize people as, but because they genuinely don't know the value of that human being, that life that is a gift to us. And I get it. It doesn't feel like a gift when you don't expect it. And we don't, so I can go on, but it is an emotional issue for me. And it's an issue that I feel like I believe I'm rational about, but I am definitely passionate about it. So I'm acknowledging up front where I am on this issue. I believe adamantly, and this is how I've always worded it, I believe that rights should be protected equally for everyone. That's where my understanding about the sanctity of human life comes from. Not that it doesn't come from us being the image bearers of God, that he creates every human being with his image and wants those lives to be protected. That's true, but the extension of that, the way that's understood in our society, in an Enlightenment-informed, a modern society, is that rights should be protected for everyone. In fact, the expressions I give to it are that justice, and I think these are equivalent statements, justice is the equal distribution of liberty, and liberty is the equal distribution of justice. We can have a conversation about it another time to clarify why I say that, but hopefully you understand the significance of it. It's not an equal distribution of stuff. It's an equal distribution of liberty or of justice, whichever way you want to say it. So freedom means maximizing the equality of the distribution of justice. And justice, righteousness for a society, means maximizing an equal distribution of liberties, of freedoms. If you're not doing that, then it's an unfair and unjust society. I recognize the difference people give to those terms, but some of that difference is also artificial. Wow, I can't help but getting in an argument with myself today. Anyway, on the way. So because of that, I view all life as needing to be regarded with equal value. So all life should be regarded as of equal value from the beginning of life until its end, including in the womb, but also including, and I say this every time I'm asked this, but also including immigrants and women and those who are economically deprived and minorities and anyone who's been subjugated or oppressed. Every life, it doesn't matter, every person. So all life should be regarded as of equal value from beginning of life until its end. And being of equal value doesn't mean you can do the same things with that life, doesn't mean you can offer the same things to that life. Doesn't mean that, but it does mean providing the same protections. So that's the idea. Here's the other way of saying that, though. Everyone's freedom should be regarded as of equal value. That's the point of the statement. Justice is the equal distribution of liberty, and liberty the equal distribution of justice. So everyone's freedom should be regarded as of equal value also, including, so listen to both of these things at once, though, because if I'll say one of them, and then half of you will want to cut me off immediately. So if you can just hang on through both statements. Everyone's freedom should be regarded as of equal value, including a mother who doesn't want to have a child, and a child whose rights are invested in her parents until she's competent to advocate on her own behalf. Both of those are rights that matter. Both of those are lives that matter. Both of those reflect the values of our culture that ought to matter to us. And the reality that there's a conflict there shouldn't keep us from being able to talk honestly about which way we resolve the conflict. But we don't do that. Instead, we spend the bulk of our time, not everyone, some people, just recently I've heard trying to build a bridge here. And I'm happy for that. I think that's important because otherwise we're just maintaining the conflict that doesn't need to be maintained. But what we ought to be doing is saying, yes, I recognize that this mother has freedoms that are going to be impinged upon. So look, when we take a society like ours that's been bifurcated for decades over an issue like the sanctity of life, it's been 50 years almost. And so we're talking about 50 years of dividing the culture down a line where we say, no, it's the right to choice that matters more, and no, it's the right to life that matters more, and we haven't resolved it. Likely, there's a conflict of legitimate rights that's going on. That doesn't mean that it can't be resolved with some kind of objective information. It doesn't mean I can't hold my position that says it's the right to life that ought to trump everything else. I hold that position adamantly, but it doesn't mean I can't acknowledge the other side. So I've got a right to life on one side where I'm talking about the child actually continuing to live, and I've got the right to choice, to choose on the other side, where women are advocating for reproductive freedom, which we recognize has incredibly important value. We recognize it even in the sense that we would look at the China one-child policy, which used to be in effect, and say, oh, how awful, how horrific that is, because not just because we think they ought to be able to have more than one child, but because it's so inconceivable. So I'm going back to The Princess Bride, but also the irony of the term in this moment. That we would allow someone else to dictate what happens in that very private part of your life. I'm not jumping ship here. I am pro-life. I am all on the pro-life side. But that reality doesn't change, that there is an impingement. Admitting that a liberty or a choice is legitimately impinged doesn't mean giving up that there's a reason which might make it worth impinging. Do you get that statement? Acknowledging that protecting unborn life does mean impinging on the choices of women doesn't mean that giving up that, protecting unborn life is worth that cost. That meaning, if I acknowledge that there is a loss to women, to their freedom, when we say, no, you can no longer have an abortion. It's just built into the sentence. Of course there's an impingement on their liberty. That doesn't mean that I have to say, oh, and it's not worth it. It's not worth it to protect that unborn life. I don't believe that. I believe it is worth it to protect that unborn life. I also, in saying those words, I also get why women would look at me and say, maybe you're not the best one to be having this discussion because I'm the one who's being impinged on by this, not you. And then they want to push me out of the conversation. I get that. I actually respect that. I understand that. And yet, I still believe that life is so worth protecting that I want to stand up and speak for it. I want to stand up and say, this is not the best solution. So, and it's in the same way, acknowledging that protecting unborn life does impinge on the choices of women. It does mean this, that we owe it to women to address the unfairness with which abortion restriction confronts them. And it's not, the unfairness doesn't have to be maintained. That's why we could say, oh no, we're going to start looking at careers differently and saying, if you have a baby, your husband and you can have the same leave. You get it at the same time. If your career is in question, whether you're the father or the mother, it's in question the same way, or not in question at all, which is the way it ought to be, because those are the things that make a woman wake up and say, I can't do this. I can't, and so on. We can have that discussion further another day. We could go down this road on 100 different topics. Critical race theory, CRT. Does it have really dangerous ideas? Well, yeah, it has some really dangerous ideas because it was originally built on Marxism. So there are some ideas in there that I think are wrong, both philosophically and in their application. Does it have some really important ideas in it? Absolutely, because there are things about racism in our culture of which we're not very effectively aware. And some of the most important ideas may be all tangled up with the really dangerous ideas. And learning from that doesn't mean that I have to just accept it all whole hog or reject it all whole hog, to stay in Texas parlance. So in my denomination, I found this happening like crazy with a thing called the ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And I always found it so odd that we would do this, that we would create an entity, this Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. We would create an entity to act as a conscience for the denomination. That statement, by the way, will offend a lot of people, but that's part of the job. That was part of the commission for the ERLC, to speak to and for. So we did both. That's what the ERLC did. So that we would create this thing to act partially as a conscience for the denomination, to speak to moral issues that the denomination needed to be more aware of. And then after creating it and saying, hey, speak out on moral issues and speak to us on moral issues, that we would then try to defund or silence that entity anytime the conscience would say something we didn't want to hear. It was just mystifying to me. What did we want them to do? If not, and I use this expression all the time, I don't mean it simplistically, but if we didn't want them to poke us in the eye, I mean, that was the point of it. So if the point of a conscience is to confront us with the things we otherwise would prefer to gloss over, if that's the point of a conscience, then being willing to hear someone who holds a view you don't hold and with which you might never agree becomes really important, because it's an opportunity for us to think better, not only about the other person, but also about how to resolve some of these conflicts in our society. And we might, on one occasion out of 100, actually learn something that would improve our own ideas about some of those issues as well. And I could give others censorship in social media and how complex that is, but we don't have time to go into that right now. And we'll do another conversation about that one. That one's perfect because of the need for free speech, but also the needs for protections from, fires in the theater kinds of expressions. So look, there is a way that we should think about this that I'm trying to drive at. So let me give you that. When we only choose a side, what we do is diminish the value of anything the other side says. When we require people to pick our side in order for us to hear them, are you one of me? Do you think the same thing I think? Well, I'm not going to listen to you. When we require people to pick our side in order to be heard, then we diminish any possibility of learning something from people who may have experienced things that we have not, who may have learned things that we have not. And we should know we can't create utopia, and we're certainly not utopia yet. And I mean that me personally, I am not the center of a utopian solipsistic universe, nor am I generating a utopian universe from myself. We can't create utopia as a society. It's not going to happen. We should know that historically by now. But we can serve suffering people, vulnerable people, even when they disagree with us. And for me, if we can acknowledge, and I'm just speaking from my perspective here for a moment, if we can acknowledge that we don't control all of our outcomes, as a Christian, this is what I have to say. If we don't control all of our outcomes, I don't control the whole world or what other people are going to do or say, nor even understand all of the possible outcomes to something, then for me, obedience to God's command, for instance, to love my neighbor or to serve those who are oppressing me, or to be swift to hear and slow to speak, which sounds odd after this podcast, doesn't it? But swift to hear and slow to speak, it begins to be a much better option because I cannot control the outcome. He can control the outcome. So I'm going to follow his teachings. And I encourage you to do the same thing.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.